Okay, right. I will kick off now. And sorry, my name is David Gow. I am on the executive of the European Movement in Scotland and a former Guardian correspondent inter alia in Brussels and Bonn, Berlin. Previously to that, back in the 1990s, and I'm very delighted to welcome you all to this webinar, the latest in a series that we've been running. And this time we're talking about the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was about a year long, and it ended on May Day this year, 9th of May. But actually it's going to carry on because there'll be follow-ups. But when we're talking about the Conference on the Future of Europe, we're also really talking about the future of Europe tout court, or rather, in the broad actually, and the role that, what kind of roles Europe will be playing, how it will expand, how it will grow, how it will change over the coming years. And of course, inevitably, since we're Scottish or Scottish based, we'll also be talking about Scotland's role therein, or putative or potential role therein as well, I hope. So anyway, just a little bit of obvious talk, which is that on the, if you want to chat, please use the chat. As such, make comments. We'll put them all in the chat. But if you want to pose a question, and I hope there are going to be plenty, please put them in the Q&A channel, because that's the best place, and I'll be monitoring that. I and my colleagues will be monitoring that. Anyway, so I'm delighted to welcome tonight, this evening, first of all, Fabian Zuleeg, who's an old friend of mine from Brussels days, and we were just discussing, nearly chief economist and chief executive officer of the European Policy Centre for almost a decade, and has written extensively about this topic. Also, I know you have extensive links still with Edinburgh and Scotland, Fabian, and you were also have been an advisor to the Scottish Government and Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister, on European matters as well. We also have Kirsty Hughes, who doesn't really need any introduction to an EMIS audience, but was also worked in Brussels for many a year, and Chatham House, various think tanks, Oxfam, but also, more importantly, from our point of view, was the founding director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations, which performed extraordinary amount of good work. I say that with a plug because I also helped her as a director. And I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Phillips O'Brien, who is the Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews University after previously being at Glasgow University, but also is a leading light in the new Scottish Council on Global Affairs, or for Global Affairs, which is only really been set up this year, or in fact it was launched in a very kind of glittering occasion at Edinburgh Castle, and he says will be producing work from the autumn or the fall, as obviously he's an American, so he talks about the fall, from the autumn onwards. Anyway, okay, so shall we kick off with you, Fabian, and tell us about what the future of Europe is going to look like?
A small question to start with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I think to talk about the future, we have to look back a bit and see how did we get where we are at the moment, and what has been happening in Europe. And I'm particularly focusing here on the last 15 years or so, where Europe has been virtually permanently in crisis. To the extent that we at the EPC have adopted the perma-crisis, because there doesn't seem to be a let-up, but also because the different crises we have been interlinked. They have fed on each other, and broadly speaking, they've all resulted in the same thing, in short-term fixes, but not into the long-term structural changes, which actually would be needed to address some of the underlying causes. And even when I sat down and tried to list the number of crises we've gone through, I've probably forgotten some because we've gone through so much upheaval in the last 15 years. But just to very briefly touch on them, we've had the huge wave of migration coming in and the political responses to that. We've had the fiscal crisis, the financial crisis, the Greek crisis. We have had Russia before. This is not the first time. Certainly 2014, there was a sense of crisis. We have had Brexit, and I'm not going to say very much on that today, but certainly, at least at the outset of Brexit, there was a real fear that this would have a domino effect on other countries in Europe. We've had Donald Trump in the White House, with all the implications that also has had for the global environment. We've had COVID, with the economic, the social, the political implications of that. And in the background, we have major transformations happening in our societies, in our economies. Just to highlight a couple of them, certainly the climate change transformation, which is necessary, but which is also difficult and costly. And the digital transformation or the technological transformation, which is going to be challenging for all of us. So this is the background, this perma crisis. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, we already had another new crisis added to this, the cost of living crisis, the inflationary effects which came from that, which are not only down to Russia. This is something which is more structural than that. But certainly the invasion has also aggravated that crisis even further. But it is also important to recognize that the invasion of Ukraine is, we've called it a watershed moment. Chancellor Scholz has called it a Zeitenwende, a new era. It is a quite decisive change to the past. So the world we're living in now is going to be permanently different from the world we lived in before Putin chose to attack Ukraine. That has already been clear in the short-term reaction of the European Union and the European Union and NATO, because I think you have to see the two of them together. But we have seen, firstly, an unprecedented sequence of sanctions, going further than anything which the European Union has done before. We have seen a quite large level of support for Ukraine, including breaking the taboo of military support, which was a very strong taboo in many countries. Now, it is still true that the United States by itself is doing more than all of Europe put together. But that's another feature of this particular watershed moment, that the transatlantic alliance, and in particular NATO, has become, well, it's not brain dead anymore, as Macron said at some point in time. It clearly is back on the agenda. And it is in many senses becoming reinvigorated also by Sweden and Finland joining. We also have security movement on the European side. I think it's worth noting that Denmark ended its opt-out from security arrangements with a 2/3 majority, something which would have been unthinkable before this invasion. We've had movement on enlargement with candidate status going to Ukraine and Moldova, and at least a certain unblocking in the Western Balkans. We've had military spending going up, notably in Germany, with a promised 100 billion in addition, and a complete renewal of its military capacity. We have had an unprecedented opening to migrants from, or refugees, war refugees from Ukraine, with a completely open door policy within the European Union. And all of that has been achieved in a remarkable unity. Yes, we had a bit of friction at times, and that is inevitable in these situations. But overall, we've actually seen the European Union acting quickly, decisively, and together. Not what would have been expected. So from that point of view, you could be quite positive. I think also, and Philip's probably will say more on that, but we can also be a bit more optimistic than at the outset of this conflict about the relative strength of Ukraine versus Russia. But I'm known to be a little bit more pessimistic than that. So I will end on a much more worrying note, at least from my perspective. What we have done up to now, the short-term reaction, was the easy bit. This was immediately triggered by what Russia was doing. It was also pushed by the United States. It was pushed by some of the big member states. But the hard bit comes in autumn, it comes in winter, it comes when the conflict becomes bogged down, when it's not so much in the public eye anymore. It comes when we have to make the structural decisions, which are equally necessary, but which are politically much harder to do. We have to decide, for example, and I haven't got time to go through everything, but we have to decide what kind of decision-making mechanisms we have in the European Union. We can no longer have a veto by one member state, as we have seen with Hungary. We have to decide what we do in the energy market. We have to address our strategic vulnerabilities. We have to have a different migration policy, a different security policy, a different long-term outlook. We need to put contingencies into place about what we do if we have a political change in the United States. We have to decide how we collectively go to react to China. We have to decide how we maintain our focus on climate change, given everything else which is happening. We have to get the enlargement process really into a shape where it becomes possible for Ukraine to become a member in the foreseeable future. We have to rebuild Ukraine while at the same time continuing to help Ukraine fight this war. And doing all of this while we probably will have some form of semi-frozen conflict with Russian troops still on Ukrainian territory. We will have to defend our democracy far better than we have in the past. We have to deal with the populists, which will start to benefit from that. And that also means we have to deal with the cost of living crisis, because politically this is a far greater issue in many countries than the war in Ukraine. So there are numerous things we have to do. If you're interested in some of the detail, we just published a paper at the EPC. You can find it on our website, which just lists, I think someone counted it, 74 strategic questions which we have to answer at this moment in time. And that's just the beginning. And the worrying thing is that discussion hasn't really begun. The question of how do we deal with the longer term? How do we deal also with the future of Europe in this context? And that is a discussion we have to have across Europe, not just at the domestic level, not just at the national level. But at the moment, it's not even happening at the national level, in part because that's not how European countries have functioned, but in part also because it is Pandora's box. You're opening something which is very difficult to deal with also politically. But if we don't do this, if we don't actually address these issues, then my rather pessimistic outlook is that Europe will lose the ability to defend its values and its interests, or at the very least will be severely constrained, will be severely limited in how it can defend its values and interests. This, in many ways, is Europe's last chance, because the other powers are waiting and they are growing, and there's a much more difficult, contested international environment in which we're moving in. So in many ways, the golden era, particularly Western Europe, has had since the Second World War is over.
Sorry, I was having difficulty unmuting myself. Thank you very much, Fabian, for that, well, extraordinary, tour d'horizon looking at the Titan vendor, as we call it, but also for looking forward at the tasks which lie ahead, which is pretty kind of daunting, actually. I did read your paper, and I did actually tweet the link to it on our site, actually. And as you say, there are 74 questions there, and I'm sure, as you say, there are a hell of a lot more. So so in a sense, obviously, maybe you're the kind of giving a slightly sort of pessimistic view about what may be in store. Kirsty, is that a view you would share, or are you more upbeat, and do you think that there is a kind of better opportunity for Europe to build on what it's done in the last sort of last period and go forward in a much more progressive and even more united way than it is now?
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Fabian, for that. As David says, tour d'horizon and scene setting. And good evening. It is evening, I guess, late afternoon here in Scotland. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us. When I sat down to think about the conference on the future of Europe, I suppose I thought two things straight away. One, given the state of the world and the state of the Union at the moment, are we even able to look to the future? Because starting in a way in the same place as Fabian, we are so beset by multiple crises in the present. You don't even have to look back 15 years, you can just look at where we are today. And where does the conference on the future of Europe fit in, or does it? Is it now a kind of a nice but rather tame exercise that's just going to be overwhelmed by where we are? And I think it did have a role, and I'll come back to that. But I think to some extent, unsurprisingly perhaps, to some extent, reality is racing ahead of political deliberations. So I don't need to list all the crises again that Fabian listed, but just the most immediate ones today: the security, the Ukraine crisis, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis. They are interlinked. The climate change crisis, the pandemic recovery or the continuation of the pandemic, and that's without looking at the wider geopolitical trend changes and instability and immediate problems. I was actually writing, this is a plug, I was writing a column today which will come out in the Herald tomorrow about the state of the Union, the EU one, not the UK one. And I mean, when you start to look at some of the things that have been happening so far this week in the EU, today the European Commission has put forward a proposal on reducing gas consumption, winter preparedness in terms of where the Russia-Ukraine conflict may go next. It's using an Article 122 to enable that, it hopes, to go through. It's not going to be an easy discussion in the Council. It's proposing up to 15% cut in gas consumption. But that is quite extraordinary. And so I think, when we think about what Fabian was talking about, short run fixes and long run fixes, in the face of some of these things that are just coming and hitting us from the side, then inevitably some of those are going to be short-run fixes, and it's quite interesting to see how the EU is and isn't coping with that at the moment. I mean, one of the things that worries me and certainly worries other people, is the risk of downgrading climate change as a priority. The Czech presidency of the EU hasn't even got it as one of its top priorities, but that doesn't mean we won't carry on with the 2030 package. On the other hand, and I don't want to divert too much into climate change, but it's fascinating, isn't it, in terms of how we as political systems and individuals, the European Commission can conceive now in the urgency of the Russia-Ukraine crisis of a 15% cut in gas consumption. But where was that for climate change? So how can we make these things more interconnected and connect the short to the long term and persuade the voters of that? Tomorrow, again, didn't mean to keep referencing back to Fabian, but it's a good counterfoil, I think, for what I wanted to say. Tomorrow, of course, the European Central Bank is expected to put interest rates up for the first time in 11 years, possibly by as much as 0.5%. Shades of the Euro crisis hanging around everywhere over that. There hope to be measures in place to contain it, but that's of course because of the inflationary pressures that are there in the EU, just as they are in the UK. On Monday, von der Leyen was in Azerbaijan, along with Josep Borrell, getting an increase in gas supply from that not very pleasant authoritarian regime. On Tuesday was a busy day, a proposal on give finance for joint arms procurement across member states, the final belated opening of accession talks with Albania and Macedonia. So this is, I mean, it's not always quite that fast a pace. This is an extraordinary pace. So of course we must look to the future, and there may be much to criticize, but I do think it's also, if we just look back at the last few months, it is quite extraordinary what has been going on. And certainly we need to, as always, hold to account what's going on. So uncomfortable things maybe for von der Leyen or Borrell, like human rights in Azerbaijan, or the question of where climate change fits in here. But I think, in other ways, and it's not much of a comparison, but if I compare it to UK politics at the moment, it obviously looks to me really quite impressive. Does the Conference on the Future of Europe then fit in here at all? It had 9 themes in its report, 49 proposals, a few hundred specific measures. It was meant to take a big look at EU priorities, policies to engage citizens with more participation, which up to a point it did. It certainly, I would say, it did that much more than at the Constitutional Convention 20 years ago, which I followed very closely. And at the time, it's not a popular point of view, even back then, I actually thought was rather good because it was an open process for the first time. So I think talking about it almost to some extent, I'd be interested to hear what the other speakers think, but it feels like 2 different worlds. So we've got this world of the perma-crisis, and then we've got this deliberative list from health, the pandemic, climate, youth, foreign policy, digital, democracy. It's not that those wouldn't be in a big forward plan, but I'm not sure how much those proposals are really grounded in the extent of the multiple crises we face. And maybe in that sense, I am agreeing with Fabian. I think it's often, and I'm guilty of this as anybody, it's very easy to critique these sorts of things, these engaging the citizen exercise. And I'm going to be wicked and say I really liked one of the recommendations that demands that political parties, civil society organizations and trade unions should be more lively. And I think that's quite a good idea, but I'm not sure, how you turn that into a policy recommendation. But more seriously, I was also struck. I just did a quick cross-check to Scotland had a large citizens' assembly that reported last autumn, came up with a very similar sort of set of top themes. And again, you have to ask, just as you have to ask for Conference on Future of Europe, does it have political and policy traction? Is it a good idea at all? And if it is, then how do we make it have traction? There is at least going to be more standing citizens panels, I understand, than there has been in the past. On the other hand, the European Commission produced a very short, for the moment, follow-up communication in response to the May report on the Conference on the Future of Europe with 4 different routes it was going to take. And the first 3 routes were basically about things the Commission and the EU are doing already. That means they're already on the case on those recommendations. And then the 4th route was where they felt the Conference on the Future of Europe had actually said something new or partly new. And of course, it wasn't just a citizens' report. It had European Parliament, Commission, Council, and so forth. And one can see plenty of their inputs there and tried and trusted demands, for more qualified majority voting, for stronger right of initiative to the Parliament, and that sort of thing. I suppose, the question in my mind, just given the extent and the urgency and the huge challenge of existing crises, is this the moment to get into an inevitably very tricky, difficult process of treaty change? We know how long that takes. We know how distracting it can be. We know how difficult it is. It doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, but is that this year's or next year's priority? And yes, we could look at enlargement, and it's great belatedly that Albania and North Macedonia have started talks. The EU took the right decision to make Ukraine a candidate. France has always said, of course, that you have to have treaty change before enlargement. And that was why in the 90s, one of the reasons in the 90s why the process took quite so long. It may be true, it may not be true when you look, as I say, at how much is being done with our existing structures. What about Macron's idea of a European political community? Is that a priority? Is that not a priority? I'm torn because, as we know, these ideas of a multi-speed Europe have come up many times in the last 30 years. But yes, apart from NATO, we need there to be a wider political process of consultation in Europe, don't we, that goes beyond either the way that candidates are dealt with or the way that the European Economic Area countries are dealt with. So I'm not as sceptical as I might once have been about such an idea, whether or not the UK is in it, perhaps under a Prime Minister Truss, but let's not deviate onto that today. And perhaps that's where I'll just end. Obviously, there wasn't any UK or Scottish input into the Conference on the Future of Europe. When you look at today's crises, they're crises that face the UK as well, whether it's cost of living, Ukraine, energy, climate, and so forth. And so, yes, the UK is in NATO, it's in the G7, but the knock-on effect of the ideology of Brexit, of course, is that under Johnson and quite likely under Truss, the idea that you might have a formal UK-EU cooperation and discussion and coordination across these different crises seems to be just one for the birds at the moment, and the Partnership Council under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement hasn't even met for 13 months, and that's before one talks about Northern Ireland Protocol and so forth. So I think in a sense that is quite extraordinary. It's an inevitable outcome of Brexit that the UK and Scotland are therefore sidelined and have less influence and have to use other fora to try and contribute. It's an interesting question, whether if the UK was still a member state, would the EU have responded better or worse you know, to some of these short-term fixes. I suspect it's doing better without the UK in many ways. But it is just an additional peculiarity of that European environment we're in. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Another, well, slightly kind of, yeah, huge issues raised there, and notably about things, issues like, for example, treaty change, as you say, and a whole raft of things, I mean, across the board policy and institutional change. And again, a slightly, if I may, you know, slightly kind of pessimistic tone towards the end. So we're going to move now to Phillips O'Brien, and Phillips, as Kirsty mentioned, there's been quite a bit on the kind of military industrial, as it were, front in Europe, whereby you know, like you know, she mentioned today the recent démarche by Thierry Breton on the kind of joint procurement of weapons, with partly with an aim of consolidating the kind of Europe's defense contractors and industrial base. And there have been a whole raft of other things, and it did so. I mean, what's your take on all of this? I mean, because I was reading just before we started, just as a kind of another bit of a cold douche, was Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, talking about how, well, no, we're not just interested in Donbass now. We're going to go for, you know, we're going to go for significant other areas of Ukraine. So where stands within this the kind of A, European strategic autonomy? Can it actually help? And B, are we actually still as reliant on NATO and the Americans, the leadership therein, as we have been for the last, since 1948?
Sure. Thanks a lot, David. I mean, for people who don't know me, I mean, my knowledge of European institutions compared to Kirsty or Fabian is very small. So I will not be probably giving you anything that you don't know about the European Union and European institutions. What I do know about is more the hard edge of security, sort of military power, defense policy, and transatlantic relations. And I have heard the pessimism from both Fabian and Kirsty, and maybe I will balance that off a little bit, because I don't think I am as pessimistic, oddly, as the first two speakers. Not that I'm wildly optimistic, but oddly, I would say this war, while it has certainly been a crisis, also points out it could result in and one doesn't want to say war can result in something positive, but it could actually result in a security situation in the future if the war has a solution that leaves a mostly united Ukraine with most of its territory, and I'm not going to talk about what that might look at. That's something for negotiations in the European Union. I'm not quite sure we understand the implications of this, because what have we seen in this war so far, and what does it mean for going forward? The thing we've seen is that Europe itself, the European nations, those in NATO and the European Union, have no conventional military threat on their border. And I don't say that lightly, but what we see is a Russian army that cannot take that much of Ukraine and has basically thrown in 90–95% of its frontline combat forces. So the Russian army, which is the greatest conventional military threat to European states in the EU and in NATO on their border, is not a threat to those states now at all. It's simply, and it will not be for many, many years. That I don't think we've fully taken into account the mauling that the Russian armed forces are getting in Ukraine. That almost the entire original invasion force has been destroyed. And what they're doing now is trying to generate second line forces. That there's no way, I mean, if that force went to, if the Russian army tried to go to war with NATO in the next few years, it would last a few hours, maybe a few days. So in that sense, oddly, you could argue from a conventional, and by the way, Russia won't be able to generate And I think this is important when we talk about security. Even if Russia decides to rebuild its military after this war, it will take it decades to become a competent military force again. I mean, it got from the end of the Soviet Union to now 33 years to create this quite disastrous military force. And that was 33 years of preparation, 33 years of investment, a lot of oil money, and this is what it made. And the idea that somehow they can turn around and then make a great military force in decades even seems to me relatively far-fetched. You'd have to have an entire systemic and economic change to be able to sort of create the kind of military force that would be a threat to Europe. So I think that actually needs to be, I cannot think of a time when Europe then, in a conventional military way, has been less threatened. You'd have to go, I mean, I don't know when, Roman Empire, maybe at some point you would say, but even that had more sort of threats on its borders than Europe would have now. Now, that does not, of course, mean Europe is completely secure. It does mean, of course, there are things on top and bottom. Russia will remain a nuclear power, and that is the question here. That Russia's nuclear weapons are still there in many ways. Of course, that will become one of the only things they have, and Europe will have to decide how it wishes to deal with Russia as a nuclear power, but a non-conventional threat, solely a nuclear power. Or it could, and it could go back to what it did quite effectively before the Ukrainian war, which is try to fight an information war. I mean, I think one of this conflict shows us there's a big difference between being able to fight a modern information war and to fight a modern conventional war. We overrated Russian power because we saw sort of the way Putin fought an information war and thought that was reflective of its ability to fight a war. So Europe will have to come up with, I think, a challenge, or have to understand how it would like to go to the top and bottom, the nuclear and the information war. And that is something I think that is worthy of consideration for European institutions. The other hopeful note I will say that I think this war has brought out, and I know there is this quite right wondering, how are we doing European economic growth, how powerful we are, look at China, look at the other places that are growing. What the war also shows is that autocracies are never as strong as we think they are. And democracies or freer societies are often much stronger than we think they are. That the Ukrainian response to the Russian autocratic threat is a fascinating one. And that's normal in peace. We often in peace always think autocracies are strong. They often have great looking militaries. They build a lot of equipment. They have a strong leader. Supposedly they threaten things. And we often mentally translate that into thinking they're strong. Putin's Russia was strong. And Europe is sort of divided and weak. But actually, if the foundation of your society is a free or open society with discourse and non-autocracy, you're gonna have a greater resilience than you imagine. So I would actually think in world terms, Europe is probably more resilient than it understands because it can have that kind of debate. We don't know how resilient China is. We don't know how resilient autocratic systems are. But we do know that actually freer systems can have greater resiliency. And in certain ways, Europe is the leader. If your lifespans, health, certain areas, Europe actually is going streets ahead of the United States right now, which is plummeting in these areas. So there are signs of optimism in the way Europeans live and the way European societies adapt that I think need to be acknowledged. Now, what I will say one other thing, and then I'll then I'll be quiet because I know we want to have a discussion. From a security point of view, what I think is fascinating about what has happened in the Ukraine war so far for Europe is that it's calling into question a lot of the preconceptions we had about who mattered in Europe and who would set the pace in the future. I mean, I'm American, but I've lived actually now in Europe almost my entire adult life, well over 30 years. And it's always been seen as France and Germany as the driving force of sort of European policy and European heart. actually the reaction to the Ukraine war, if you're looking at it from a security point of view, you are seeing nothing like France and Germany as the leader. I mean, Germany seems to be having a nervous breakdown in front of our eyes and doesn't quite know what it wishes to be in terms of European security. I mean, Scholz's speech at the beginning was, people said it was a great moment, but since then we've not seen Germany able to hold it together. The French have also given quite mixed signals, whereas what has really mattered, what has really mattered in this is the Scandinavian countries, the Baltics, Poland, and Czechia. This arc of nations have a very sort of close security concern. They've been the ones that always have been more security driven towards Russia. And what's been fascinating is how they have made the difference. They have not been looking to Germany and France to provide any leadership. In fact, they've gone streaks ahead of Germany and France. They've started just to provide what they want to provide. They're not sort of looking to get approval of the larger powers, and they've passed them behind. I was really struck, just before I came on here, that the Danish former head of NATO, Anders Rasmussen, just had a piece in the Atlantic going after Macron on Macron's policy. So I wonder if, and by the way, if you add up security and economics, those areas represent, you know, a huge part of European success. Scandinavian countries, the Baltics, Poland and Czechia, both in future growth, but also in a lot of the high-tech stuff that's coming out now. So it might be that actually what the war has shown up is that there's a different kind of Europe where different areas of security common interest that would provide the heart of a new, if, as we say, if the United States goes away and Europe has to look after its own security more, and that wouldn't be a bad thing at all in my mind. In many ways, it would be a good thing. The United States will and probably will turn more to the Asia-Pacific region. The area that would drive European security wouldn't be France or Germany. It would be probably this other group that has behaved really quite, I don't want to say in a unified way, but in a far more focused way when it comes to Ukraine. So those are my more optimistic. I mean, there's certainly are problems going forward, but at least I don't see quite the doom and gloom overall that some others see. I think you're muted, David.
And I'm trying to get myself unmuted. Right, success at last. Good. Well, thank you very much, Phillips O'Brien, for that very interesting. I'm fascinated, actually, particularly because having worked in Germany as well as in France, that what you say about the Franco-German tandem or locomotive or engine, as we used to call it, especially in the light of the fact that the kind of what's been extraordinary to me is the change which has happened and Fabian will know more about it than me, that's happened in Germany itself, actually. I never thought I would see the day when Green ministers would be like the foreign minister and the economy minister would be making the kind of arguments they're making for arms procurement and for arms deployment. It is quite absolutely astonishing. When I was there 30 odd years ago, the whole thing was about the real fears they had about out of area, any activity out of area, outside the NATO area, and so on and so forth. And it was very much more pacifist mode there. Anyway, what do you think, Fabian and Kirsty, about what Phillips has just said about a different kind of Europe emerging through this war in a way? And can I also ask, well, we can move on to this another one. So what do you think in the first instance, what do you think of what he was saying about that the old Franco-German tandem effectively is no more, and there will be a kind of a different constellation in Europe, driving effectively integration and unity forward?
Who do you want to go first?
You go first, Kirsty, you're fine, yeah.
Okay, I mean, I don't entirely accept the pessimist label. I think part of what I was trying to say was I'm actually quite impressed at the moment, by the way the EU is juggling all the balls. I mean, you know, and of course there's going to be plenty to criticise at the same time, but I think, and including, you know, to criticise sort of relatively sort of slow or confused French and German responses on the Ukraine side. But I think, you know, when you look at the range of stuff that is going on and the steps that are being taken, you know, and you think Euro crisis, pandemic, climate, Ukraine, you know, this is no small stuff. And so I don't think it's pessimistic to emphasize, as both I and Fabian in different ways did, this extraordinary range of crises at a time of geopolitical uncertainty, instability and change, and where we don't know, you know, who's going to be the next president of the US in a couple of years. I think on the, is this a different Europe? I mean, you know, we could do a whole seminar on, was the Franco-German driver a Franco-German driver? And of course, you know, the common answer to that is to say the point is they're often on opposite sides, and therefore if you could broker agreement or compromise between them, you'd fold a lot of other member states in. And of course, it used to be that if you talk to countries like the Scandinavians and the East Europeans, or the Dutch, for instance, about Brexit, they'll tell you that, or they would tell you a few years back, that there were the triangle, even if Britain was not somehow quite as powerful as the French and Germans, that triangle was, you know, made it even more helpful for other member states to, you know, have a range of places where they aligned or where they led and pushed things as a group. So on the one hand, no, but on the other hand, you know, I'm not disagreeing with the way you've described that in this particular crisis, and it is quite politically extraordinary. And okay, the UK was there, but it wasn't in the EU. So I think that is a very interesting dynamic. But yeah, you know, it's an EU of 27, and it's got north, south, east, west divides, and it's got shifting alliances depending on different issues. I don't quite take the economic point I think you were making, but certainly, yeah, it will be interesting as this unfolds further to see how that rejigs power balances in the EU.
Fabian?
Yes, I can try to be optimistic because there have been positive signs, and I would also highlight one more thing, which I think has gotten lost a little bit in the recent developments, but that was the response, the economic response of the European Union to COVID, where I think for the first time, I would say we actually, within one of these crises, jumped over our own shadow and did something which was a taboo at the European level, which was politically very difficult, but which was actually pushed through by the Franco-German engine. So it's not quite as dead as it might seem. So that was a very positive sign, because it did show that also the European Union collectively could learn from the mistakes which had been made in the past. There was a recognition that the response had to be different than the response in the financial, economic, fiscal crisis, which was there. But where I get a bit more pessimistic, and maybe I will be proven wrong, and I hope I will be proven wrong in future, is that I think this is no longer about Russia and Ukraine in many ways. Yes, of course, that conflict will continue. There will have to be continuous support, continuous focus on that. But we are already starting to see that we're now getting to some of the more structural underlying questions. And I want to just take one example. There are many examples I could choose, but just to take the example of enlargement. We ended up giving Ukraine and Moldova candidate status against a lot of misgiving in a number of countries. And essentially it was the trip to Kiev which changed minds. There was a very clever bit of, and I'm not saying anything against it, but there was a very clever bit of moral blackmail, which worked very well. But when you actually talk to people behind the scenes and you ask them, what does this actually mean? You're getting two responses, which both of which are entirely contradictory to each other, and both of which are impossible. One response is, and you're getting this from some of the Eastern European member states, you're getting this from some of the security community, which basically says Ukraine should be in the day after tomorrow. Despite all the difficulties which are there, the strategic importance of getting Ukraine in overrides everything else. And you have another group which says, yes, we've given them candidate status, but we all know it's never going to happen, or it's going to be so far away that in reality, it's not a real prospect because of the reforms which have to happen in Ukraine, but also because of the reforms which would have to happen within the EU, because of the implications it has for other accession countries. So for me, both of these positions are impossible. They cannot happen. Ukraine cannot become a member very quickly, but we can also not be in a situation where this becomes a never-ending process like Turkey, where Ukraine never becomes a member state. But we're not even having this discussion. We're not actually sitting down and talking about what kind of security guarantees are we going to give to Ukraine? What kind of energy market are we going to have? Even I just saw within Germany, now the CDU lender are saying, yeah, but we'll still use Russian gas after 2022. So there is a lot going on underneath this where there are real differences on the long-term reaction. And there, I think it comes down in the end to the importance of political choice, the importance of making decisions, and the importance of leadership. And unfortunately, when I look at that at the moment, I'm getting rather more pessimistic. As I said, I hope to be proven wrong. I hope that our leaders will actually start to communicate that this is going to be a hard autumn and an even harder winter, that there are real costs and sacrifices which will come with this because we are in a war. And whether we like it or not, this will have consequences. And it will hit the German economy. It will hit some other economies even harder. It will mean that people will be cold this winter. And that's something Europeans are not used to anymore. And that's something I think we have to actually have a much more open discussion, because if we just go into that without having this overarching reasoning behind why are we doing all this, what is the long-term benefit we're getting from that, then we will lose the populations in this. And that is my great fear, that by autumn, by winter this year, things will look rather more shaky than they did before. And what all the perma-crisis has taught us up to now, as soon as politicians lose their populations, they start to roll back. And that, I think, and when you listen to some of the things Putin is saying, when you listen to some of the things coming out of China, there is a question there of, let's wait and see. Let's wait whether Europe will still be that united, that decisive. Let's see whether people are really willing to put their money where their mouth is, willing to endure some of the hardship which comes with this. So I think the jury is still out, but unfortunately, I'm a little pessimistic.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Could I just sort of shift focus just briefly then before moving on to the, the audience's Q&As? During this period we've been talking about, of course, one of the things that's happened is that, the reality, and this is no surprise to this audience in EMIS, is that the daily grind of Brexit is moving on, And, it's a horror story. I mean, there are, none of us can see any material benefits at all, but only kind of lost opportunities and so on. Is there any role, do you see any looking forward and Kirsty said that there'd be no British or UK or Scottish input into the conference. No, I think they were invited. They could have done it if they'd wanted to, as far as I understand it. What kind of role do you foresee for the Brits and and explicitly also the Scots to be playing in the construction of this future Europe? Philip, so you don't have a go as an outsider?
I mean, the Brits' role is going to have to be through NATO. It's certainly in the short term, it's not going to have much influence in the European Union in constructing a security architecture. If the European Union wishes to construct a security architecture, its role is going to have to be through NATO. And I thought Johnson's goodbye speech today revealed the truth of Brexit throughout. As he said, for Brexiteers, the number one policy is stay close to America. That's what Johnson said as leaving.
Yeah.
I would say to what I've learned is stay close to America. And so I think that is, by the way, the underlying rationale internationally of Brexit. It's always been an Atlanticist. It's been an Atlanticist fantasy. So I don't see what Britain can do other than help European states such as the Baltics or Eastern European ones like Poland, who sort of look at Britain in a friendly way, help them prepare more, prepare their forces or help them in certain security areas. They can certainly play that role, but it's going to be as an aid, not a driver.
Right. Okay. Kirsty, have you got any thoughts? I mean, not just on the security side, but also more broadly as well.
Just briefly, yes, obviously it depends what sort of UK government we have. So that although Keir Starmer has said, which is hugely disappointing to put it mildly, that he's not going to challenge Brexit or even try and unpick the trade deal into a softer Brexit. At the same time, we know that he'll try and do much more than the Tories, at least at the margins, and in ways that will actually at least start to build a somewhat more positive relationship, whether that's on sanitary, phytosanitary and things that will make borders work better, which is interesting in the topic in the context of Scottish independence as well. But I mean, you don't have to be even Keir Starmer. If you look back to, I can't remember now what that document was called, but the one part of the future political perspective document that Theresa May did with the EU talked about setting up a future EU-UK foreign policy structured cooperation. And that's anathema to the true Brexiters and their ideology. And I would have thought that's actually one of the easier ones for Keir Starmer. He doesn't know what to do about free movement or following EU regulations or any of that stuff, but at least having a more serious relationship where you will talk to the EU as the EU rather than insisting it's bilateral with France and Germany or G7 or whatever. I'm not assuming we have a Labour government, but at the moment the polls make that look quite realistic. So in that sense, I do see change, but obviously that UK is not going to have any influence on decisions on how fast or seriously the Ukraine enlargement process works. And of course, UK used to be an extremely influential voice on earlier enlargement. So it depends.
Fabian, have you got any views, especially also notably about Scotland, where you have been an advisor here on this, as well as the UK? And it's this whole, Kirsty mentioned it briefly in her opening comments about the European political community, Monsieur Macron idea, which he came up with on the night. Is this a non-runner? Is it just, une certaine idée which has got no future?
Yes, on the EU-UK relationship, let me read something briefly, because I think it's important to recall it. and in particular, the Union and United Kingdom are determined to work together to safeguard the rules-based international order, the rule of law and promotion of democracy, and high standards of free and fair trade, workers' rights, consumer and environmental protection, cooperation against internal and external threats to their values and interests. A ambitious, broad, deep, and flexible partnership dealing with economics, law enforcement, criminal justice, foreign policy, security and defense, and wider areas of cooperation. That is what the UK and the EU signed up to, and it is a complete illusion at this point in time, because the reality is that not only is this UK government not willing to cooperate with the EU on any of these issues, but it is actively destroying the relationship. You cannot expect to have a relationship which is law-based, which is treaty-based with the European Union, if you're breaking the treaties which you've signed. So ultimately, unless there is a complete change in the direction of the government, and that also means personnel change, because these people are not trusted anymore by the European Union, the EU-UK relationship is in a dire state, and it's not going to improve. It might improve with a different government, with a different approach. It might improve with a different prime minister, although it has to be said the most likely one seems to be Liz Truss, who is already tainted by exactly what I was just talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
So overall, I don't see very much prospect. And unfortunately, the reality within that context is that that also limits quite substantively the possibilities for Scotland to cooperate with European Union partners. Because in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, the relationship is determined at the national level. It is determined between the government of a third country, as the UK is now, in coordination, in cooperation, or in negotiation with the Commission representing the member states. So I'm afraid from a European perspective, while there is some sympathy for Scotland, in concrete terms, that means very little at this moment in time. Of course, it would be a very different situation if Scotland was an independent country. That is a completely different trajectory, and the European Union would also react very differently to that. But for the time being, I think, yes, there are some areas of cooperation, but even those will always be constrained by the limits which are imposed by the UK government. So to give one example, what would be very important to Scottish universities is to be able to continue to be part of the corporations, both in terms of Erasmus and in terms of Horizon and research money. It's not going to happen as long as a UK government decides that is not what it ideologically wants.
Yes. Yeah, we know that. We're campaigning to change that kind of point of view. Quite. Anyway, so moving on to the questions from the audience. There's a whole series around here, which relates to what we've just been talking about. For example, Tony is asking, could security involvement tempt the UK government into renewed European engagement other than through NATO? And Bill is asking, does security offer a means for the UK government to rehabilitate the EU? And indeed, Joe is asking, is the UK irrelevant to continental Europe and the shared perma crises going forward? Phillips?
Sure, I'll say a few things. I mean, it can't be irrelevant because it's one of the largest military powers in Europe and it has nuclear weapons. So, I mean, I wouldn't use the phrase irrelevant. I think it's what influence can it have is the really important question. Security, I mean, this is one of the areas, if we're looking at areas of potential UK cooperation with continental Europe, EU countries, not institutionally the EU, and a chance to try and build the relationship up, it would actually be probably in shared military procurement. There is an area for cooperation because hopefully, I mean, Europe, whether we like it or not, is one of the largest military spending areas in the world. When you add up all the military budgets, a lot of it is spent terribly inefficiently. In fact, European states are pledging to spend more on defense. Now, what Europe could really benefit from is, instead of all this replication that you see from European countries, actually some cooperation in producing equipment across Europe. And since Britain plays a significant role in that, I would argue that provides a sort of a framework for cooperation to perhaps set down some roots and set down some pan-European with the UK cooperation. And I think that would be very sensible. And one thing actually I wouldn't do now is go out and spend a lot of money right now. Because right now we don't know actually the real lessons of this Ukraine war. And I know everyone's saying we must spend on the military, but what are you going to buy? If you want to say, oh, I want to spend all this money, what actually are you going to buy and why? And I'm not quite sure we know the lessons of the Ukraine war enough to say, yes, I want to buy a lot of this or a lot of that. In fact, this is could be an important transition war and understanding. So if it's not direct country to the EU institutions, it could be something of shared procurement processes.
Anybody else? Kirsty or Fabian? Kirsty?
Sure. I mean, I think partly it relates to what I said in my previous answer. I mean, while you have a Conservative government with the sort of Brexit ideology and the willingness to undermine the fabric of our democracy through lies and pretense and breaking international law and so on and so forth, then it's very hard to see any routes to more serious UK-EU cooperation. If you change government, I mean, people around Starmer seem to be periodically briefing The Guardian and other newspapers that they can't say anything brave or very positive on the EU at the moment, but once they're in, once they've got power by not talking about Europe, then they'll be able to do more. So I don't know if who they think they're taking for a ride when they say that. Is that the Red Wall who they want to win back, or is it the Remainers who they think might still vote for them? So I think on the one hand, I think that's a bit tricky, but nonetheless, I think if we had a Starmer government, you might be on the way back to a somewhat more normal UK government. You've got the most recent YouGov poll that said, with hindsight, 60% of people think it was the wrong decision to leave the European Union. I think, though, even if you get a Starmer government, if I was sitting in Brussels, I would be very cautious about the sort of cooperation I'm committed to. I would breathe a sigh of relief, but if there's a possibility that 4 years later you're going to get another mad Tory government back again, just as there is in America, for the next presidential election, then again, you're going to have to be very cautious. And I also think there is a real problem that moving towards a soft Brexit, as Theresa May herself found, even though she didn't call it that, is extremely difficult. The EU doesn't want the UK to cherry pick the single market. The UK, after all these debates around Brexit and the EU, is surely not going to accept being a rule taker, to all EU regulations. But the EU is not going to accept Britain back in the EU, even if it decided in 10 years' time it wanted to. I don't think so. I think they would want to see a decade or more that we were a sensible country again, and we're many years off that. So I do think the relationship can get better if it's not a Conservative government, but it's going to be a slow process.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. You're sure you're right. Can we just sort of revert through the questions back to Russia for a while? There's a couple of quite interesting ones. As one from Michael Gill, assuming that Putin is defeated in some form, what's the possibility of bringing Russia into Europe? Not full membership, but maybe the EA or even the alternative, or is this something that can never happen? I think that might be looking back to, was it the NATO summit? Was it 2006 or 2008 when there was a lot of talk about about Russia having a kind of partnership with with NATO? And there's also a question which is not entirely related, not so similar, but in which Sandra asks, is it too reassuring to reflect on the ineffectiveness of Russia's conventional military power when Putin is looking east and building his links with the PRC, the People's Republic of China? What if Xi calculates that it's in China's interest to align the PCR with Russia? What do you think of that? Phillips?
The second question about China, I mean, China had allied with Russia, but China's not going to, I think, stick. I mean, I'm not a China expert, so I think we have to be careful. But I think what we've seen from the Chinese government so far is they don't want to go down with the ship. That when it comes to their alliance with Russia, they have to believe Russia is strong enough to fight a war with Ukraine. And if Russia is showing that it can't actually fight this war and fight this war well, I can't see China pouring a lot of money down that rat hole to keep sort of this country going in a long-term war. I mean, the Chinese would rather this war end and end now. That it's not in China's interest to keep this going. And when it comes to economy and trade, the Chinese trade interests are almost entirely non-Russia. I mean, it buys oil from Russia, but it does very little business with oil, with Russia, other words. And it's not going to sacrifice its trading relationship with its economy in a very, very delicate, I mean, there's one thing we haven't been talking about quite so much in Europe. The Chinese economy is in a very delicate stage right now. And there's a lot of worry about property prices and sort of property bonds. The Chinese want economic stability now. They do not want a crisis. So I can't believe, my own view is I cannot believe they would somehow go for sort of to try and exacerbate this crisis and have a falling out economically with the United States and Europe and things like that.
Have you got a view, Fabian? What is your sort of views about this?
Yeah, I think firstly on Russia, I'm not a Russia expert, so I can't say how likely it is that we will see significant change there. My impression is it's rather unlikely. But even if we did have a significant change, both in terms of the readiness of a country like Russia and in terms of the ability of the European Union to absorb something like Russia, I think it would be virtually possible. So even something like the EEA, I think is a very long way off, if ever. But I think the reality is going in a different direction in any case. And I think some of the irony of this is I would hold that economically, Russia has lost this war already because it has essentially lost its most important market, both in terms of where it sells to, but also in terms of where it gets its technology from. So it will become pretty much a vassal state of the People's Republic, because there is no other choice for Russia anymore. If it can't sell its oil, its gas, its resources to Europe, it has to sell it to China, and China is not going to treat Russia in a nice way. That's not the Chinese way of dealing with these kind of situations. And that, for me, I think points to a much broader issue, which I also brought up in my opening remarks, that we live in a much more difficult and a much more contested world where countries are very much out for their own. They are seeing how much they can extract from any given situation. And that's the situation Europe will have to deal with.
Mm.
So we will have to decide, how do we actually stand to China? Are we willing to stand up to them on human rights, on trade? Are we willing to call them out on their placid support to Russia? Or are there other things which are overruling that, like the German car industry or whatever other interests we might have? But I think the reality, and it is a stark reality, and I think this is something which many people in the West have to face now. We had a belief, especially in Europe, and especially within the European Union, that we could solve some of these conflicts of interest at the global level through economic interdependence. That economic interdependence, because it was the answer in Europe, would be the answer elsewhere as well. So by tying Russia very closely to the European market, we thought that this could never happen. By tying China closely to the Western markets, the German markets, we thought that China would continue to be a partner which would develop towards something which is more constructive. And the reality is this is not happening because the politics overrides the economics. And we've even seen within the direct neighborhood of Europe that with a member state, the politics overrides the economics because clearly Brexit has no economic justification. It is entirely driven by sovereignty ideology. And that is the world we're living in. And that is a much more difficult world to deal with.
So, Kirsty, what implications does that have for Europe, would you say? I mean, this suggests that actually there should be far greater self-assertiveness on the part, or an autonomy and self-sufficiency on the part of the Europeans going forward. Is that your take on it, or what? How do you see this from what Fabian was saying, his analysis?
Well, up to a point. I mean, I don't. He'll tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but I don't think he's saying we're at the end of international trade. It's just about what the political impact of that is. And as you know, there is already obviously a debate and policies and so on, and discussions in Brussels about how to be more resilient in strategic industries, or where to strike the balance between intervening on national security grounds, versus, broadly defined, versus just letting free markets roam. But we've also got climate change, and I was very struck, as I guess everybody was, to see wildfires from Greece to the streets of London. We may not be in the EU and we may have a mad ideological government, but actually we're part of Europe, and then we are, in terms of the heat wave, and we're also part of the world. And China is an extremely unpleasant authoritarian regime and genocidal in Xinjiang, but it's and we have to, we can't ignore, or we shouldn't ignore that. But on the other hand, I'm not a China expert either, but China is investing hugely in wind and wind farms, and we can only tackle the climate globally. So yes, we're in a different world, and it's not at all an easy world. But we're condemned to cooperate in Europe, and we do that quite well and positively, and condemned is probably the wrong word, but we're also, to some extent, we're condemned for the sake of the world to attempt to cooperate internationally still.
Yeah, Fabian, you want to add on something, I believe?
I just wanted to say something on climate change, and I'm sorry for being relentlessly pessimistic, but I do worry that we might have seen the peak of international willingness to really tackle the issue. Because I think the cost of living, energy prices, inflation is a real challenge. And it's going to be very difficult to maintain the political consensus that climate change needs to be addressed, despite what we're seeing at the moment. And it seems paradoxical when Europe is actually seeing the effects immediately. But, and I'm not just singling this out because it is the UK, because I think this is something, but if we are seeing that a serious contender for the leadership of the UK is talking about moving away from net zero commitments. It is becoming more politically acceptable already to start questioning some of that, to start the narrative about, yes, we have to do this, but not now, because now is too difficult. Now we have security concerns. Now we have the price concerns, the inflation concerns. So I think there's a real battle coming about maintaining the focus on climate change globally in an environment where cooperation is more difficult.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that entirely. Phillips, you want to add something, I think?
Just yes, my optimism, by the way, pretty much extended to traditional security. When it comes to climate change, I might be the most pessimistic person here, for the reasons that Fabian and Kirsty have said. I wonder if politically we've reached the point where nothing will happen for a while if we enter an economic downturn, as was said. So my optimism, we might say, needs to be understood within certain defined limits, because I think the climate change one, I'm become more pessimistic, certainly. But it's not a European one, just it's the world. So.
I think many of us would agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, indeed. Can I just sort of like, we're coming towards the end now, so there's just a couple of if we could revert to our own neck of the woods. There's Sarah, for example, asked earlier, what role would an independent Scotland have in the EU, particularly in the field of security and defence? So it relates to what we're talking about. And a sort of final coda to that. Is there anything more than team sympathy for Scotland without independence? Fabian, since you said we're going to get a lot of team sympathy, maybe you could answer those two questions.
I can try, but I'm afraid I don't see much more structurally than tea and sympathy. I think there are, of course, areas of cooperation, and that will continue. And there are areas where it will also be necessary from an EU perspective to continue working. So, for example, some of the North Sea cooperation clearly involves EU countries and non-EU countries. There is a coordination issue on some policy areas, including, for example, fisheries. But overall, I think this will be severely constrained by the member state, because ultimately, by the state, because ultimately that's who the European Union deals with. It doesn't deal generally with other entities. Of course, that doesn't mean there are not many things where there are linkages, cultural linkages, the ability to talk to people, that will always be there. But it does take it back to the kind of relationships the European Union has with other countries around the world. It's not any more deep or any more structural than that. And in many ways, unfortunately, because of the behavior of this current UK government, is actually worse. For some other countries, they can participate in research cooperation in other areas, which the UK looks likely not to be. But I think turning to the other side of that, what would be the role of an independent Scotland in the EU? I think firstly, I have no doubt that if Scotland becomes independent in a constitutional process and is willing to fulfill the conditions for membership, that it would become a member of the European Union rather quickly. We can debate what rather quickly means, because that's always difficult in the European context. But I think that the final destination would not be in question if that is the wish of Scotland. clearly Scotland would have to apply and would want to be part of it. And that would also mean that Scotland would be part of all the mechanisms which are there. And there, in the context of security, I think it's important to reflect that in many ways the EU has become a moving target now. The European Union of today is nothing like the European Union of even 6 months ago. It's nothing like it was 2 years, 3 years, 5 years ago. So the kind of European Union Scotland would join is different. And I think that's something also which needs to be considered. And the longer the UK and Scotland are outside the European Union, the greater that distance is going to become. We are in a process of divergence, not just because the UK government wants to have divergence, but because also the EU is changing, and that will have implications. But I think for me, the final outcome would not be in question as long as Scotland becomes constitutionally independent and then applies for membership in the usual way.
The usual way, yeah. Kirsty, you're going to have to go in a second, I believe. So, can you just, what's your take? You know,
I think, I mean, obviously there is a little bit more than tea and sympathy in the sense that Scotland trades with the EU. One statistic I keep repeating because I think it's really interesting, given the way the debate here goes about independence, is that Scotland's manufacturing exports to the EU and EEA are almost identical to its manufacturing exports to the rest of the UK. So the potential benefits, at least for manufacturing from independence in the EU as a much bigger market, are interesting. I'm not sure if I try not to be as pessimistic as the other two on climate change, but when you look at the EU, last month had a joint statement with Norway on encouraging further oil and gas exploration, I think even in the Arctic. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon and its government has put quite a lot of emphasis on the Arctic and trying to get some voice as a sub-state in that. But in the end, if you want real influence in these questions, if the union you're part of is in the state houses, that's not great. I take Fabian's point on divergence, and obviously the efforts at alignment in devolved areas that the Scottish government are doing are limited because it doesn't cover the board. But in fact, we're going to have a general election within the next 2 years. I mean, if there's complete chaos under the Truss, perhaps government, maybe it could even be sooner. And the Scottish government is going to run that as a quasi-referendum, whether the opposition like it or not. And if there's tea and sympathy from the EU, and there certainly is, given the events of the last six years or so, that's not going to be unhelpful. Obviously, the EU is not going to take sides on Scotland's constitutional dilemma. Obviously, you can't just have a unilateral declaration of independence because you get 51% of the vote in an election. There's going to be a political issue. You're going to have to agree where that takes you with the UK. But I don't think, and I wrote this in a Herald column yesterday or the day before, you know, I don't know if Fabian would disagree, but I don't think the EU is going to jump up and down and say this is like Catalonia, just because, funnily enough, the SNP say a vote for them in the election is a vote for independence. You know, or what if, contrary to all expectations, the Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court, said you could hold an advisory referendum through Holyrood? That ticks the legal box. I mean, Brussels may look a bit askance then at the opposition saying we're going to boycott it. You know, so tea and sympathy doesn't take you too far. But if you think, actually, this deadline Nicola Sturgeon has set of the election is both bold and it's also very risky. And if it doesn't work, then in another 2 and a bit years, we'll be having a rather different discussion about looking much longer into the future, I would think, for potential Scottish independence. But at the moment, that horizon on this particular issue is quite short, and that's quite interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Where are your Scottish Council at, Phillips? Have you got any final comments you'd like to make on that particular issue?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, basically, the Scottish Council of Global Affairs is a new sort of research-centered think tank. I know Fabian's very careful about what we call ourselves, and sort of we have these sort of different purposes, but we've been set up by and where we want to cover all of Scotland. It was originally a team from the universities of St Andrews, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, and now expanding otherwise in civil society groups to create a sort of a research center think tank to do policy level research coming out of the expertise that we have here. And also, by the way, working with the Scottish and UK governments. We're backed by both the Scottish and UK governments. So it's very early days. We just sort of appeared in April, and our plan is, we're working out our budget and our research plans. I will say that two of our main research themes to start with are the High North and feminist foreign policy. And we have a lot of very interesting sort of areas that are going to be coming out of those two main research strands in our first year. And speaking to this group, one thing we're going to do is have a lot of public facing events as well.
Okay, great.
So
very good. But you're now a kind of, you're now a kind of almost a Scot. So, I mean, do you have a view about the issue, just speaking personally?
About what issue?
About, is there going to be more than tea and sympathy for Scotland?
Oh, I assume, I mean, there's not going to be anything unless there's I assume, a referendum granted by London. I mean, no matter if Scotland runs any advisory referendum or does anything, unless this is a legally sanctioned referendum from the Westminster government, unless the Supreme Court says Scotland on its own can run a legal referendum and declare independence, which I can't imagine the Supreme Court would do. That no, because Scotland, I mean, Spain on its own, Fabian and Kirsty, Spain is not going to allow a region to break away unless it's entirely legal and approved by the center,
right,
to go into the European Union. That would be my guess on that. I think, I mean, speaking in just complete political calculation terms, there's only one shot at a referendum in the next 8 years. And that is a hung parliament in the next election where the SNP holds the balance.
Okay.
And I would say that would be the most likely way you would get a referendum.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll invite you back on to the next one, or the one after that, where we discuss this issue. We've come quite a long way today, quite a long way this evening, and so I'd like to thank the panel a lot for taking on all these questions and providing this I call, the two d'horizon that Fabian gave us at the start, but you've all continued in that light, and we've had a extremely good debate and discussion about Europe. I'm not certain if we've entirely discussed. We certainly haven't discussed a hell of a lot about the Conference on the Future of Europe, but we have talked about the future of Europe and about where it's going and the issues that it is likely to come up with and face. And also, I think it's been very realistic, and as the famous guy said, Gramsci himself said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And we're certainly optimistic that Europe has a really good future, and we want to be part of it. So, can I thank the audience all very much indeed as well. You've been great, and thank you for your questions, and to the panel, most of all, actually, for giving up your evening and spending time with us, and I look forward to welcoming all of you very, very soon once more. Thank you. Bye. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Ciao.